Everyone, this is Jerry Inspired, very special guest. I'm sure you've seen him in your YouTube feeds. This is Professor Tristan Brown, who teaches Chinese history. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Jerry. I'm happy to be here.
Did you know that YouTube would promote your stuff all the time, or was it kind of random?
No, it was totally random. We had no idea. I had no idea that the class would become as popular as it did.
You graduate from MIT. You're talking to your relatives or your children or whatever it is. What are you going to talk to them about? You're going to talk to them about this class. You're going to say, hey, you know, the Three Kingdoms, I know something about that. Because this is the type of thing that people want to talk about, not whatever, Python or whatever. So this character up at the top appears on Oracle bone inscriptions. Doesn't look like something you recognize a lot, okay? But it's composed, it's a composite of two separate characters. Did anybody recognize it? It's Hao. Yes, it's Hao. So it's composed of two separate characters. It's Hao, right? Or Hao, right? It's two pronunciations possible. And so you could basically see how they combined it.
Let's just start from the beginning. Were you always interested in China, or was it kind of an interest that evolved later in your education?
I would say it was an interest that is started in the 2000s, right when I was finishing high school. It was, that was the era where, there was about to be the Beijing Olympics. It was that whole generation, and there was a lot of interest in going to China and checking it out. And I went and I loved it. And what I particularly struck me about China, in addition to the food, which the food is of course great, was all the history there, right? And China's a historian's paradise. And there's so much, if you like ancient, if you like modern, if you like whatever you like, that China's got a lot of history. And so I had loved history as a subject growing up, right? So I loved history as a subject, and then I kind of encountered China when I was about 18. And then the rest, as they say, is history, right?
Wow.
I just kept going back, and I just kept getting deeper and deeper into it.
And was that your major in undergrad, history?
So I actually did languages primarily in undergrad. I did Arabic and Chinese at Harvard. I was originally starting out in Islamic studies and Middle Eastern history. That was kind of my first. I had some sort of family background in that from my my mother's side, with some Syrian family, and so I had been really interested in Damascus and the whole history of the Middle East, and so that's what I thought I was going to do, and then it just so happened that China was. There were just so many opportunities to go to China in the 2000s, right? So there was a lot of money, meaning like there could be summer trips that schools or Chinese universities would sponsor. So there was just a lot of opportunities to go. And so I took advantage of those. And then I realized, I said, I'm going to follow the opportunities as my interests, of course, evolved. So, I mean, I'm still interested in all different types of history, but it just so happens that my professional career took off in the way it did with China.
Wow. And did you narrow down on a focus in Chinese history, or was it kind of still maybe an evolving kind of thing for you?
Well, it's always evolving. I mean, so again, when I say I'm interested in Chinese history, I really am sincerely interested in all periods, all times, all places. Now, that being said, where you are, right? So if you're in, let's say you're a student in Southeast Asia, you're a student in Japan, you're a student in Russia, you're a student in Western Europe, you're a student in the US, what you will study might be slightly different, because every area has had its traditional strengths and focuses. So when it came to, it wasn't that I was particularly transfixed by the Qing dynasty, although I am interested in Qing history. It just so happens that, if you're in North America and you were coming of age at the turn of the 21st century, there was a lot of resources if you were doing Qing history. There was a lot of people, Mark Elliott, Pamela Crossley, and many, many others, who subsequently came along, many of their students. So there were a lot of resources. Now, again, if I was in China, I may well be a historian of the Tang Dynasty, right? Or I might well be a historian of the Han Dynasty. It's where the resources are, where the expertise is. And of course, China is also very geographical within China. So like, for instance, if I was growing up in Xi'an and I was going, to school somewhere in that area, I mean, what a place to do the archaeology of medieval China, right? So, I mean, again, it's very much sort of where you are, and you look around and you say, where are the resources, right? What are the opportunities that are there? And then you take them. Of course, again, having done that, I still, as I was saying, have a great appreciation for other eras and other times and other places, right?
Yeah. And I think this is a good place to kind of talk about the class you were teaching that started blowing up in everyone's feeds. How did you prepare? Because that's a survey course. It starts from the very beginning. How did you prepare for that?
Well, I'm going to be honest with you, is that I mean, I prepared for it just like I would normally prepare for my regular classes. I mean, what it was I was approached by, the Office of Open CourseWare at MIT. And they were like, why don't we record the course? And, of course, I was sort of like, I was busy, I had a lot going on. I was teaching 2 classes that semester. So it was, I had other stuff. But then I thought, why not? Let's give it a go. Let's give it a try. And so we did it. We didn't record, I think, every session, but they recorded a number of them. And basically there are things I had to get used to. Namely, like you can't step in front of the PowerPoint, and you can't, do this and that. I mean, so it did take a little, and they put a microphone on you and all that stuff like that. So there were things that it took getting used to, and I wasn't completely used to. But I mean, generally speaking, you just pretend like the camera's not there, right? You know what I mean? And that's probably the best way to do it. And then just do it. Now, of course, I recently did answer to some questions for the Office of Open Learning about the class specifically. It is a different dynamic when the cameras are in the classroom, right? There's no doubt about it. It's different for the students. It's different for the professor. It is a different experience. And I do think it's very heartening to see how much interest there really is in Chinese history in this kind of class. But for the very same reason, it's also why it's so difficult to record a class like this. I mean, especially if we were doing the modern period, right? You can only imagine how, politically sensitive, delicate, students asking questions, making sure everybody's anonymous. There's a ton of stuff, legal stuff, right, that kind of would have to go into such a class. So, but even Dynastic China's got its sensitivities as well. So, so it's tricky.
What is the student makeup of the class? Is it all undergrad? Is it grad students? Is it kind of half Chinese, half non-Chinese?
It's a great question. I mean, one of the things that, so first is, it's mainly undergrads, but we are attracting some grad students, and that's been, happening now for the past few years. The thing is that it does attract a fair number of students of Asian heritage, broadly speaking, Chinese American, of course, Korean American, you name it. But I mean, again, you have to remember, you'd have to look at what the overall demographics are of MIT versus, everything like that. So I don't think it's so exaggeratedly so, right? You know what I mean? And we do get a mix, especially I would say for the modern history class. Maybe the students who they don't have a connection to China, they've never been to China, they might not have a family connection to China, but for the modern history class, they're a little bit less intimidated to take it, or they think it's relevant or whatever it is. Whereas dynastic history feels a little bit more intimidating. It's a little bit further away. But again, I will say that both classes attract a mix. And it also changes every year. It's like you can't explain, you can't predict. And the other thing is, I mean, I'll just be honest. I mean, it's curious of, you know, we have been in the past few years attracting more and more students from Harvard, which is an interesting thing because, you know, typically students from Harvard would go to MIT for technical subjects. So it's very interesting to see them come over for a class like this. So yeah, so that's what's been going on.
That's awesome. And I think since I didn't go to college in the Boston area, that's one thing that the Boston area has. So I'm sort of giving a pitch for the Boston area. There's a lot of colleges around there. So if you want to take a class at a class or a class in a college that, you know, you want to go, you can do it, right? It's a little harder, not impossible in other places.
Oh yeah, and I mean, and after Dynastic China went online, you know, I've received emails from students from UMass or students from BU, and you know, they've asked if they can drop by and everything like that. And I've always told them, you know, I said absolutely, you know, just send me an email, let me know you're coming. But please, you know, if you're in the area, and Boston's a relatively small city with a high density of schools, so it's not that hard to get from place to place.
Exactly. Do you find there's any common misconceptions that your students have of either your course or of China in general, or whatever era that you go through?
You know, I mean, yes, there are a lot. It does, you know, and part of it is that I know we're talking about the Dynastic China class, but I most recently taught the Modern China class this past spring at MIT. You know, I think that here's what I can say is, you know, what's a pleasure about teaching this class is you get to see real generational change in the United States. When I first started teaching this at MIT 6 years ago, you know, the questions from students would be like, can we go to China? Is it safe to go to China? Is, you know, there a warning about going to China? You know, there was the whole COVID, you know, time, right? Now, I mean, I feel like the overwhelming atmosphere is one of positivity, right? Not exclusively so, but that's the atmosphere. It's like students are like, they want to go, you know, they've consumed Chinese products, you know, they're like way more exposed to Chinese, like whether it's video games or bubble tea or whatever, right? Like all that stuff, it's just part of their lives. So there is a sense that they feel closer to it. And so therefore so that's changed. And like, you can see that change just like over the last 5 or 6 years. And it's real. So I don't know if it's China maxing. You know, maybe I get some students who are quote unquote China maxing, but I do think that there is influence from social media. There's influence from just like, you know, various corners of their life. And they're like, oh, let me go. And so, you know, the students, they want to, you know, they take the class and then they're either planning a summer trip or a family trip or whatever it is to China or to Asia. And I think that's great. But it just shows you that things change really quickly, you know? And so, you know, at this point, how I, you know, again, it's like, it used to be, you know, let me give a pitch for why you might be intimidated about this place or scared to go to this place or whatever. Let me humanize it. Let me try to get you into why. So now it's, you're getting even, some of the students I fear are even romanticizing the PRC a little bit. And so that's another, but you know, that's again, more modern China question. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I understand, you know, it's like in various times in my life, you know, I've romanticized the Song Dynasty, you know what I mean? Like you know, they say you get up in the morning, you have to find a passion, you have to find things that, you know, give you hope and everything like that. And I understand that. But, you know, but it's been interesting to see like just the attitude shift, right? And I've noticed that.
For your classes, do students have to write papers, or is it more like you do tests for them? What do they have to do to kind of engage the subject?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I mean, so basically when I first arrived, I was doing papers, and I do like papers in some ways. Like I do miss them, what's really nice about having the paper was that you had the students who would like, there was a Tong poem that they really loved and they really wanted to write an essay about, or there was some subject that they really wanted to delve into. And the paper, that type of project would enable them to do it. The problem is with LLMs and everything like that, it's just, I'd have to set up Google Docs and track changes and have them like map it all out. And the bottom line, and so ultimately, I think for most people coming into the class, most people don't have a huge amount of background knowledge about these subjects. So we do a midterm final. So it is an exam heavy subject. And some MIT students complain about that because this is one of their sort of humanities, social science subjects. But again, it's like, in their econ classes, they have exams. So I figure, hey, you can do it in a history class. So a midterm final, and then we do have a Slack channel. I used to do discussions on Canvas, but I'm kind of getting away from that. And I really like actually just having a Slack channel, and it's live. And, we just like, if I see a news article, I post it, people have reactions to it. And so like, there's a participation about like students have to participate on the Slack channel over the course of the semester. Right. And so that's their kind of thing. And then we're also opening like recitations or like discussion sections with the TAs because the class has just gotten so big. So we're going to have to basically, so there's going to be, whatever it is, 7 meetings over the semester or whatever. They get into small groups and debate, talk about the subjects, things like that. So it's a combination of showing up, attendance, participation, and then exams. And in terms of like, it's less, I have to say, project-based than some of my other like smaller seminar classes are.
That makes sense. I'm about to start a class in July that's like that. Like the professor said, you have to schedule office hours with me. So it's like, there's a little bit of participation, but mostly exam quiz type of stuff.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
It's so funny too, talking about LLMs, because I know people who now, even when they write an essay, it's all their own work, but they put their essay through like a LLM checker anyways, just to see in case they accidentally get a false positive. So even for the people who don't want to use LLMs, it's changing how they write because they're like, I don't want to write in a way that makes me look like I used a machine. So like, it's so funny. Like historians will look at this period and definitely analyze it.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's really fascinating. And I mean, just to say, like going back in the Song Dynasty, it's, every time there's been technological change, there's been people who have been like, opposed to it. And so that's one of the beauties of Dynastic China is that China invented so much technology in a way over the centuries that you can see people's reaction to it. I mean, China was a leader in movable type, right? And it was very interesting when that was getting popular, movable block type and printed books. There was a group of, what we now refer to often as the Neo-Confucians in the Song Dynasty, who basically thought this was the end of reading. Because prior to printed books, you had to, if you wanted to really learn a book, you had to copy it up by hand. So reading was writing the book or rewriting a book literally. So think about Lord of the Rings, right? Think about if you really want to understand Lord of the Rings, you sit there and you rewrite it, right? Sentence by sentence, and then you really know it. And so now that there were all these printed books that were going to flood the market, the Neo-Confucians were like, people won't read anymore. They won't truly read anymore. Reading will become a passive activity. And of course, in a way, yes, that is what happened. But we still went on and we still studied things and wrote things and everything like that. So this is going to be a big change, but it's within that broader history of technological change.
Funny story I always had about Chinese inventions is, so obviously the Chinese invented the compass.
Yes.
But what's funny about how the compass is described in Chinese is 指南针, right? The needle that points south.
Yeah.
So like the compass that we now use points north, but back in the day, they really cared about the direction of south, was obviously just the opposite of north. But it's funny that they called it the point south needle. I always thought that's funny.
That's right. That gets into like the orientation of buildings and like all different types of like building structure, architecture in China. And I think that like the compass, if you think about it, like what do people use compasses for? It's so interwoven with that sort of broader world, right? So I think that it's like the south facing, it's like that's information that people needed to know or wanted to know. The other thing is, I'll just say really quickly, if you look at like the Selden map, right, Ming Dynasty, incredible map of Southeast Asia and everything like that, the way that the monsoon works, the way ocean currents work is, it's actually quite difficult to get on a boat and to just dart out into the sea, you know, going east. The direction, if you're leaving from Guangzhou or Quanzhou in Fujian or one of those cities, you get out and then you hit the current and you go south, right? The ocean current takes you south. It takes you by Vietnam and then keeps going south. So if you think about it, for mariners who often also need compasses, right? The southern direction was the direction that they were going to go in when they left China. You know, that's again, probably not related, but just an interesting note of what is the use of south, what is the use of north in, you know, China and in Europe, for instance, across the centuries. Kind of interesting.
Yeah. And while we're on this topic, if we had to, let's say, drop you into a dynasty of China, which dynasty would you really want to go, whether for like a intellectual purpose or even just to live for a few years?
Oh, wow. It's really tough. It's really, really tough. I mean, well, you know, cuisine, right? I mean, so again, it totally depends on what you want to visit. The reality is, you know, we have to remember something, and it's hard to admit this. If you're talking about like we want to enjoy dishes that, you know, we would enjoy in China today, more or less, you'd have to go pretty late. You'd have to go late Ming or Qing, because the tomato and so many other things that we take for granted came from the New World. And so it's the Columbian Exchange and all those crops that came into China relatively late. You know, various kinds of sweet potato, various kinds of, you know, all of that stuff, right? I know there might be somebody correct. You know, there's different types of sweet potato, and some of them China had, and some of them came from abroad. You get my point. But corn, you know, all this stuff that came from the New World. So the thing is that if you go back to the Tang Dynasty, or you go back, you know, 2,000 years, the food is going to look quite different, and just in terms of the ingredients that are available, right? So that's not to knock it. That's not to knock it, right? It's not to say it wasn't good, but it's just to say it would be different. So now, in terms of seafood, right? In terms of seafood, if you go back to Song Dynasty, and especially if you're on the coast there, some of the seafood dishes are quite old, right? You know what I mean? Because that's been there for a long time, right? And especially, we have the first cookbook we have in China that's preserved is written by, I believe, a woman, or ascribed to a female author from the Song Dynasty from, I think, Zhejiang province. There's been an English translation of it. It's an incredible study. What's interesting about that book is it's mainly about, you know, again, preserving, right? We have to think about, with food, history of food, pre-refrigeration, right? So especially with seafood, right? So either you're going to eat it fresh, or you're going to salt it, right? Or pickle it, right? Or find some way to preserve it, right? So you kind of have to think, I know this is a very long-winded way to get to your question, but it's like, I'm just saying, like, when you go back to a certain dynasty, or you go back to a certain era in history, you have to think about what to expect, right? So food-wise, it's going to be, you know, the past is another country, as we say, right? It really is. So there's be a lot there. And obviously, you know, it's hard not to say the Tang Dynasty in a way, especially that early sort of first 75 years, you know, 100 years of the Tang, that quote unquote golden age. You know, it would be incredibly impressive and inspiring to walk around Chang'an. it would be incredibly interesting. You know, the largest city in the world at the time, this incredibly cosmopolitan center. It would just be so interesting to see all of that. And you know, it's so different, right? You know, and I mean, it's so different. You know, the status of women in the Tang Dynasty is very different. You know, again, the presence of new religions like, you know, Zoroastrianism and Manichaeism. I think Manichaeism for sure was there. Islam had just arrived. You know, it's super fascinating. I think in terms of, you know, in terms of, I mean, there's a strong argument for the Song, right? There's a very strong argument for the Song. Song had, you know, an incredibly interesting politics, right? You know, with real, you know, officials who wanted to change things, who wanted to do things, and real debate. I mean, wow, the Song Dynasty has some incredible political debates. You know, and is so intellectually rich and also culturally rich, right? I mean, the Song sets the stage for a lot of what we kind of come to think is traditional, quote unquote, Chinese aesthetics. Garden culture starts, the landscape paintings, all of those things. I think that, like, you know, a period that I would not want to go back to, but is so incredible, and I'm actually redesigning the course to just have like a week on this, is the Ming-Qing transition, which is incredibly devastating, and really, you know, you wouldn't want to live through it. Lots of people died. I mean, and but when you look at what happened during the Ming-Qing transition, it is like a Hollywood movie. Okay, it is so dramatic, that transition of, you know, the last Ming emperor walking out of the north gate of the Forbidden City, walking up Coal Hill, committing suicide. You know, the Wu Sangui turning sides at the last minute and then going to betray the Manchus down the road, right? I mean, you know, the characters are like unbelievable. And I always say to my students, the Ming-Qing transition was so dramatic and so unbelievable that within like 30 years of it happening, like the 1670s, 1680s, I can't exactly remember, there was on London stages a play being performed called, you know, the tragedy, China, or something, it was called something like China and the Tragedy of the Tartars, which refer to the Manchus, or China, a Tragedy in 3 acts. And it was about the last Ming emperor. I mean, that's how far this story spread, right? You know what I mean? Not to mention, you know, like, you know, Koxinga with Zheng Tenggong, him becoming a huge player, not just, of course, in Taiwan's local history, but in mainland's, you know, what becomes mainland, and then the Qing, and then also in Japan. So, I mean, like, the Ming-Qing transition is like an incredible historical moment to study. And it just so happens it's not only one of the most dramatic dynastic transitions in Chinese history, but it's also one of the better documented ones. So that it just makes for incredible subject matter.
2 things to support what you said. My dad's from Sichuan, and for example, the whole pepper thing was brought by the Portuguese, from my understanding. So like Sichuan cuisine that we now associate with the ultra spicy hot, that stuff didn't exist a few hundred years ago.
Yes.
And so it's like, if you go back in time, you wouldn't even know my people in Sichuan what they ate. I mean, we have documents of what they ate, but it's not what they eat now, right? So that's like a cuisine example. My thing, and I think my version of your kind of appreciation for that Ming-Qing transition, I would love to study, but not really live in the era after, when the Qing kind of just, you know, sort of fell apart a little. All the barbarians from north came, and so China had like almost like a second period of what you would call like a Europeanization, like as in like there were hundreds of schools of thoughts everywhere in China, and that was also like a very violent period, but also like there was a lot of art, a lot of literature, a lot of music.
Well, it is a little bit interesting that, you know, I don't phrase it in this way to students, but you can't escape it completely. That why is it's the periods of division that seemingly have, you know, this intellectual flourishing, this cultural flourishing, and in a way, I want to make it very clear, because there's again a historian looking back. We don't want to romanticize really bloody, terrible eras that you wouldn't want to live in. But at the same time, you know, it does pose this interesting question of like, eras of stability versus the eras of quote unquote disunity or warring states or whatever. Is there something that, you know, goes on, you know, philosophically, or, you know, people reflect on all of the carnage from the wars, and then that makes people really like seek other alternatives, right? That enable, moments of real change, right? So there's no doubt about it. Like, you know, when you go back to the warring states, the Zhuzi-Baijia, the 100 schools, all of this, you know, Confucius and the Confucian movement, they're really on the cusp of like the breakdown of the social order. In the Eastern Zhou, right? So, I mean, I think that that's, you know, certainly influenced what they were reacting to.
Yeah, exactly. I was in China last year, and I visited Nanjing, and
Yeah.
so I visited all these like, I guess you wouldn't call them like um federal level type monuments, but more like, you know, slightly less of like an attraction. But it was really interesting kind of looking at some of them. And then like Nanjing was the capital of so many kingdoms, you know, so many, and like I just didn't realize that it was the capital of all these like smaller kingdoms during different like disunity phases.
Going way back. Yeah.
Yeah. And I was just like, wow, it's so fast. Like, for example, I didn't realize that during the Three Kingdoms era, the kingdom of Wu was already doing some of the maritime trade that you mentioned. Like, that's like, they were trading with Southeast Asia and stuff back then. Like, you don't really hear about this stuff if you like just do History 101 of China or stuff like that.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, there's a lot of, I mean, you know, there are a lot of surprises. There are a lot of things that when you see it, it changes, you know, the way we think about, you know, various historical eras. I think that Singapore has a museum dedicated to, if I'm not mistaken, a Tang era shipwreck that was basically a Chinese ship, or maybe it was an Arab ship that was filled with Chinese merchandise heading for, you know, ports in, you know, basically whether it was Yemen or the Persian Gulf. And it sunk off Singapore, and then they retrieved, and now that's a museum in Singapore, I believe. And I remember going there maybe 10 years ago, and it was fantastic because it gives you this totally, you know, like new window. I mean, that's the beauty of material culture. That's the beauty of what a museum can do for you, right? A museum, you know, when you go to a museum, part of it should be about like, oh, you know, confirming what you already know, right? You know what I mean? I'm not saying it should be all surprises, but you want to be surprised, you know, a little bit. That's how you learn stuff, right? So it's like those kind of like, oh wow, why is that there? Why is that so interesting, right? And it was this whole thing of like, even during the Tang Dynasty, that big export market, it was so vibrant.
Yeah. So the book you wrote, Professor Brown, how many books have you written? Is it 2?
I've written 1 book.
Okay. And the book you wrote was about sort of that Ming Qing kind of transition era, right?
It was mainly Qing. It was, I mean, I use some cases from the Ming. I use, but mainly Qing sources, mainly 19th century. Because that's when it comes to historical archives, those are the archives we have. You know what I mean? So like, that's what, it wasn't that I was particularly attracted to the 19th century. It was just that those were where the best local legal sources were. You know what I mean?
I see. What was the process like writing your first book? Was it you started out with an idea and it kind of morphed, or like tell me about book writing?
Well, I wrote it before LLMs, so that was one thing, right? You know, I guess that's a good thing, but it made the process different than maybe maybe it would be today. I don't know. Back then, you know, it was. I mean, it took me about 10 years to write the book. From the time of doing research during my doctoral work, and then postdocing, and then finally landing a permanent academic position, and then going from there, or tenure track academic position, and go from there. So I wrote the book during that whole process, right? And you know, you sit with the material for a long time, right? You really get to know those sources. And, you know, you think about how to order it, you know, how to put different types of cases together, different types of stories, where do they belong together? It's extremely difficult to do, honestly. It was very, very hard to do. But, you know, I think it turned out pretty well. And, you know, I've been happy with the results, and I wouldn't do it again, in the sense of I wouldn't write, you know, I mean, what I mean is by that is I'm now on to different topics, right? So now I'm writing a history of ice or frozen water in China. Totally different, you know, I mean, yeah, a little bit related from, you know, the environmental history perspective, you could say, but, you know, but different, right? So you kind of, you know, with the historian, you spend a long time with one era, with one bunch of cases, and then you finish, and then you go on to something else.
That ice thing sounds amazing, because I think most Chinese people, especially who live through the new era of sort of capitalism, market economy, they were used to a time when everything was so polluted, so everyone boils their water. So to see Americans or Westerners drinking ice water, I think was always a little, even for when I came to America, you know, I came twice. The second time was a little older when I came, and even then, for like 2 years, I would still boil my water. I just like the taste. So it's like, it's so cool that you're studying ice. But please tell us more about that.
Well, first of all, we have to point out here that Americans are odd on the world stage here, because it's not just that they consume ice. Americans consume a lot of ice, and part of it probably has to do with the fact that the modern ice trade started in like 19th century America. It started with basically, I mean, the globalized ice trade. There was a guy in Massachusetts who basically was looking out at Walden Pond one day, and then said, like, if I could cut up those huge blocks of ice and ship them to the Caribbean, I could make a killing. And that's basically the start of, you know, the first major, like, you know, long distance cold trade, you know, as like exporting ice, you know, and using more and more ice. So basically the US, part of it was the US was an early adopter of ice and refrigeration technologies and all that stuff like that. So therefore, like, we put ice in everything. And Americans also have, you know, I don't know, it's a chicken or an egg thing, but Americans also have a sweet tooth compared with other countries, like even compared to other countries that seemingly eat sweet. American stuff is way too sweet. So these two things kind of go together, and I mean, perfectly encapsulated by like the Coca-Cola, right? You know, the thing is, a Coke does taste, I mean, it's a delightful drink, but you need to drink it cold, right? You need, like, it needs to be consumed cold, because otherwise it's cloyingly sweet, right? So it's like, that's why their whole thing was a polar bear, right? You know, I mean, it was like, you know, so it's like the soft drink industry, the soda industry, you know, iced tea, right? You know what I mean? Like putting a bunch of sugar and, you know, like ice and tea, and, you know, it's the same principle, right? So the thing is that we do a lot of ice, which either then helps us do a lot of sugar but these two things are connected, right? Chicken or egg. China didn't do either very much, right? Which is to say, China, refrigeration comes to China. So let me put it this way. China's been icing things for a long time. The Zhou, the rites of Zhou have, sacrifices to the ancestors, have to be on ice and things like this. Bodies of rulers and everything like that, preserving them initially on ice. Like there was uses of ice. Ice was used. But ice is a tricky subject because ice is a tricky object because you cannot create it on demand. So you're stuck in a world where you either have too much of it or not enough of it, right? So depending on the season. And then it's a question of how much of it can you preserve into the summer months, right? And so that does seem to change over the centuries. The Song Dynasty again seemingly gets very good at ice preservation. We have poems, song lyrics, etc., song era lyrics that are talking about the sweet desserts served on ice in the Hangzhou summer, right? Like from 1,000 years ago. Like it's incredible. In Hangzhou's got a hot summer, right? So that's part of it, right? The other thing is, however, there's a limit, right? There's a limit to how much, because again, that's not the same as refrigeration, like modern electrical refrigeration, where it's like we can just produce cold on demand. So basically, I'm tracing the history of this in China, and looking at sort of like, where does ice appear in historical sources? How does it appear? How do people use it? How do people think about it? How did that change over time? And I'm also, there's also ice as infrastructure. What I mean by that is that rivers in northern China froze and armies could cross them. That was a really, really big dynamic for the northern Chinese border, for the borders of northern China, because we often think, or we have this idea in our mind of the border of, or envisioning the Great Wall, right? The Great Wall is like a northern boundary, especially in, like, let's say, Ming Dynasty. But what people don't realize is the Yellow River, the Ordos Loop there, the Yellow River in its upper reaches, it juts way out into Mongolia, like basically what is now Inner Mongolia, right? It juts way north. It goes way north of the Great Wall. So the thing is that every winter, the rivers would freeze. And so what used to be a barrier between the steppe and China becomes actually a highway. So the northern Chinese border was most porous actually in the winter months when there was the most ice, because ice flattened the sort of landscape. So I'm looking at sort of ice as a commodity, ice as infrastructure, ice, in all of these various contexts.
That sounds like a very fascinating book, and
Thanks.
I am going to be excited to read it. Do you know when you'll publish it, or do you think this is maybe like 3 years down the line kind of thing?
Maybe 3 years down the line or so.
Mm-hmm. We just don't appreciate sometimes how big China is, and I forget that the Yellow River, it is a long river, right? Like we forget. Oh yeah, if you go that way, it goes very.
Yeah. Well, and also Dongbei as well. Manchuria is filled with rivers, right? It's all rivers, right? Heilongjiang, right? It's Jiang, right? That's the name of a river. Actually, if I'm not mistaken, I think all three Dongbei Sansheng, all three provinces of Dongbei, are all named after rivers, one way or another, right? Liaoning is Liaohe, Heilongjiang, right, is the Heilongjiang, and then Jilin is a Manchu. I believe Jilin is a Chinese word from a Manchu word for like that particular branch of the river, I believe. Yeah.
Wow.
So,
yeah. Again, it's just because another thing that I think we tend to think about is, oh my goodness, southern China is so water rich, but northern China is so water poor, right? That's like the sort of like the stereotype, but it's not actually completely true either.
Well, yeah. So the issue well, Manchuria is fertile. Manchuria's got the black soil, right? Manchuria, I mean, Heilongjiang is fertile. The problem is that it's got a short growing season. So the thing about Manchuria is you got to get in there, you got to plant, and you're going to get, you know, whatever 1.5 crops like over the course of a year. You're not going to get what you get in South China, like with, you know, a much more temperate climate. The real issue where you're absolutely correct is you're correct for the North China Plain. And you're correct for, to some extent, Xibei, depending on where. So the North China Plain is basically where the Yellow River comes in, and all of a sudden it's now much more shallow, and that's where that lowest builds up. And it's like Shandong, Hebei, everything like that. They can be very dry. They've had drought, you know, many times over the centuries, and the Yellow River can change course, and then that screws everything up. So there's a lot of aridity and dryness there. The same with Xibei, Gansu, Shanxi, things like this, even though, you know, like let's say in those provinces, of course they are connected to river systems, but the problem is it's all about where you are, right? It's all about where you are, right? And so, you know, you have to, in order to do rice, you have to be really close to a lot, like an abundance of water source. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, exactly. And that makes a lot of sense then why, you know, the Northerners they don't do rice as much, right? They do other crops.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and you know, it's like, well, and you know, you can grow it, for instance, in Bombay, right? Because they do have an abundance of water there, right? But it's about the growing season.
Yeah.
That's the issue, right? So so it's also, it has changed, right? The landscape of China's agriculture has changed into the 21st century, but it is kind of true that, yeah, for sure, like the story of it has been, you know, the rice growing south, you know, over the past 2,000 years plus.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess we could talk a little bit about your seminar course, the environment course. What made you want to teach that? / what was your interest in that? How did that start?
Well, for exactly the reasons that I'm talking about right now, right? Which is the first book on Fengshui, the second book on ice. You know, an interest in the Chinese environment, an interest in sort of environmental questions in China, and also using the Chinese case to think through broader human questions of the environment, right? So I think like that course was all about that. And it was also a chance for me to get a break from the big survey courses, which I love. Don't get me wrong. I love those big survey courses, but you know, it's like you do need a break once in a while, right? And so something smaller, something with students who really want to be there, you know, things like that. You know, who are working on research projects, right? You know, related to the subject of the Chinese environment or design or architecture or whatever. You know, it's a pleasure to sort of have that. It also attracts more graduate students. You know what I mean?
Are there any other subjects that you want to write a book on, or are you pretty dialed in right now on environment, ice, and all that?
I'm pretty dialed in. I'm pretty dialed in right now on this on the ice question. I mean, it's a pretty big subject. It's a pretty big book, but I mean, I've been interested in the history of Chinese cosmology, divination. You know, I've published on those subjects quite a bit. I've also, you know, I mean, I've have a long-standing interest in the history of Muslims in China. Right, regarding like kind of related to a little bit of family background and also my background in Arabic and Islamic studies and all that stuff. There's a new book. There's a new book by Ali Akbar translated into English. He's a Ming Dynasty guy from the Ottoman court who wrote a history of Ming China, or a travelogue of Ming China in Persian. Ali Akbar's Book of China, which is now just translated into English for the first time. I know some of the translators, or I've met some of the translators over the years, and I think it's a wonderful, wonderful book. I'm so glad that they did that. So that's a rich topic, and I mean, there's a lot to say there. I mean, China was very connected to, the Muslim world, especially from, anywhere wherever you could put the Song Dynasty all the way up, through the Qing, it's a real part of the story of Chinese history. So I have a longstanding interest in that subject, and I've always said I was going to write a book about Islam and the Ming, but I always get sidetracked by something else. And I've done it again. So that's my answer to this question.
Well, I look forward to that book one day.
Thanks so
too,
much.
because yeah, that's just something. You go to any city in China, for example, they got the Lanzhou Mian, which they have in America now too,
Yes.
right? Like,
oh yes, yeah.
it's crazy.
I mean,
that Lanzhou Mian came to America, but yeah, like that's an example. It's like they're still honoring people that keep kosher.
yeah. No, I mean, absolutely. I mean, you're totally right. I think, well, it's very funny because some of the earliest Chinese cuisine to get to the United States was cuisine from the Canton region, right? Cantonese, and also maybe some Fujianese, right? But basically Southern Chinese cooking. But if you think about it, if you were looking at China today, if you had to, basically say which Chinese cuisine would most easily travel abroad and appeal to, let's say, European taste or Middle Eastern taste or whatever, it would probably actually be Xibei cooking, because they have the mian, right? It's all the mian stuff, right? So it's basically like, it's Italian spaghetti, right? It's Chinese mian, Chinese guzhou bing, guzhou rou mo. It's like a hamburger, right? Actually, like, the Xibei Cai has a claim for being like, and also, Xinjiang food is so connected to, Persia, Turkish, all of those foods, right? So that's actually, but in a way, but part of it was the history of Chinese migration abroad, it was a lot more Fujianese and Cantonese went abroad. So they brought their cuisines with them, right? And it was the Xibei, the folks up in Xibei, they didn't go abroad as much, at that time. So it's very interesting to see, we're seeing in the internationalization of Chinese food, Chinese cuisine, we're seeing, hot pot, as from Sichuan, right? Hot pot's now everywhere. I think noodles, Lanzhou Lamian, that's going global. I think I saw Lanzhou Lamian in Dublin, Ireland. What I mean? Like, they're all over the place. So I mean, really, or maybe it was a Xi'an Mingchu or something like that. It was something Xibei, right? It was something. So it's really exciting, and it's really fun to see the global story of Chinese food. That's a big ongoing story.
Yeah. It sounds like maybe one day you'll write a book on that too, like Chinese cuisine.
Somebody will. It won't just be one person. There'll be a lot of it. There's always a lot of interest in that.
Yeah, exactly. So obviously, I will link the MIT course. Of course, I'll link your book too. How else can people find you? Do you have your own YouTube channel or stuff like that, or Substack?
No, I'm not so active on social media. I have an X account, a Blue Sky account that I just retweet mainly. Once in a while, if there's a historical question, I'll comment. But it's mainly just me, looking out for new books that are published in the field. Those are the easiest channels to find them. And then that's mainly what I do. So I mean, so people can feel free to send me an email. I received a lot of wonderful supportive emails after the course went live, and I was so happy to see that. A lot of people, of course, want more published, and I'm sympathetic with that sentiment. But again, it will have to be maybe sometime in the future if, MIT and I decide, let's tape some more classes, everything like that. Maybe we'll do it. We'll see.
I guess for viewers that see this, leave any questions you have in the comment section and stuff. And yeah, Professor Brown, I would love to bring you back in the future. Maybe like we'll do this once a year. And
Yeah, that'd be great.
yeah, that'd be great. Especially I'll be a year into my master's then, so I'll have definitely some thoughts. And yeah, we could touch base then.
Sure, absolutely. Congratulations on your master's. That's a wonderful program.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and this is the beginning of more conversations. So
Cool.
everyone, this was Professor Tristan Brown.
Thanks so much, Jerry.